Hello, my name is Pat Sather. Welcome to this program about preserving historic records. We are coming to you from beautiful All Saints Chapel, located near Elkhart Lake, Wisconsin. The chapel is maintained by Grace Episcopal Church in Church-Sheboygan, and Sunday services are held here from Memorial Day through Labor Day. To guide us through the topic of preserving important records is Dr. Betty Potter, who for 30 years served as archivist at Grace Episcopal Church. Historic Grace Episcopal Church has a treasure trove of materials that have been saved from the time of its founding in 1845. This is not intended to be a thorough history of Grace Episcopal Church, but as Betty speaks to us about preserving records, we will hear a lot about the history of Grace Church. At the end of this year, Grace Episcopal Church will mark the 175th anniversary of its founding, so the timing of this recording is very appropriate. During Dr. Potter's tenure as archivist at Grace Church, she sorted, cataloged, placed in archival safe folders, filed, and then later digitized a large number of records that we have in our collection. The fruits of her many years of preservation work can be found stored in archival safe files, binders, file cabinets, and boxes, all located in the dedicated fireproof archival room in the lower level of Grace Church. More recently, as part of a grant at Sheboygan's Mead Public Library, Betty oversaw the project that digitized much of the historic records that we have, which means that these records are now accessible on 3 websites, and people from our church and the wider public can view these documents. So, who better than Dr. Potter to speak to us about preserving and making available for future generations these historic documents? Welcome, Betty.
Thank you, and thank you for your kind words, Pat. I have to reciprocate by acknowledging Pat. She's been very helpful to me in the archives. It was her idea to do this recording today. She helped me with a big 150th anniversary book, and she also helped me with that scanning project she talked about. I couldn't have got any of it done without her, so thank you, Pat.
You're very welcome, Betty. So tell us a little about your background. First of all, growing up in the church.
I was baptized, confirmed, and married at Grace Church, and I was in the Sunday school and the youth group.
You began as archivist, but you continued with other activities at Grace Church. What were some of those activities?
Well, actually, I started as a Sunday school teacher, and then I was the coordinator of Christian education. I was an altar guild member, and I was on the vestry.
How did your love of history develop?
Wisconsin history was taught when I was in 4th grade, and my classroom visited the Wade House, so that really piqued my interest. And I had pioneer ancestors in Sheboygan County, and one of my aunts would show me old 1870 pictures of the family members, so that piqued my interest too.
What prepared you for this work, Betty?
I worked in libraries, and I took library science courses. I'm the family genealogist, so I've also taken genealogy courses. And I was the co-founder of the Sheboygan County Historical Research Center, which is a good place for beginning archivists to learn some pointers. And I was the director of the Sheboygan County Museum.
Before we hear about your activities as archivist, please tell us about some of the early archivists at Grace Church.
Father Curtis was our first archivist. He started at the church in 1911 and started saving things from that point on. He was also the historiographer for the Diocese of Fond du Lac, and he wrote the first history book for the Diocese of Fond du Lac, the first 50 years. Other clergy after that, noticing what he had done, started saving things too. And I'm going to go through a series of several pictures showing just a sample of what we have in our archives room. Great. So here we have an annual report. This is a later report from 1997. We have a brochure about the windows in our church. Here's a choir boy's diary. It was written from 1879 to 1890. We have our church charter from 1847. Here's a newspaper clipping from about 1890. The clergyman on the left is Father Hopkins from Grace Church. That's a boarding house he's standing out in front of, and he ate his meals at the boarding house. There are two other clergymen in the picture, but it's hard to identify them. We have a copy of a letter from 1847 in which the writer describes the sinking of the Phoenix off of North Point in 1847. She was writing to her uncle, I think, either her uncle or her father, who was a bishop in the Episcopal Church. We have full-page newspaper articles that feature big events at the church. This is a picture of the interior of our first church building in 1860. That's Father Blow on the right. We have lots of photographs and lots of albums. We have manuals, this one from 1909 to 1910, listing parishioners and other things. This is a copy of one of our first newsletters, The Messenger. This one is from 1900. We have scrapbooks. This particular scrapbook is from the 100th anniversary of the first church service in Sheboygan, in Episcopal Church service in Sheboygan in 1845. So this was Easter 1945. And here are some of the black and white pictures from Easter 1945. That's Father Elwell. And then we have a commemorative bulletin from that celebration. And we also have copies of sermons. This one was July 1st, 1875. The building we're in right now was dedicated, and we celebrated that dedication every year for a long time. And this is a sermon that Father Sweetser gave. So we're very fortunate that all of the clergy up until this point in time have done such a good job of keeping things, because we have a very thorough history.
Who were the historians that followed Father Curtis?
Ruth Winfield was our historian. She wrote the booklet, the history booklet, for the 125th anniversary in 1972. Father Elwell started keeping the scrapbooks, and then Hilda Lohr followed in his footsteps. She was a parishioner. She kept them up. John Kalk wrote recollections for our big 150th anniversary book in 1997.
Now we come to the time when you enter the archiving scene at Grace Church. How did it happen that you began the work of archiving?
About a year before our 140th anniversary in 1986, Father Mills asked me if I would take charge of the archives. So here we have a newspaper clipping about our anniversary events, and that was part of his plan, to have an archivist.
And how had historical material been stored up until that point?
The material had been sorted in order to publish the earlier historical publications. But for the most part, it was just stored loosely throughout the church, in Sunday school cupboards, in an old safe in the back hall, and in the damp rectory basement. So it was my job then to sort by category, store by category, compile an inventory, and make notations in the inventory about where the things could actually be found in the archives room, and then to discard things later on.
When Father Mills left, Father Sloan arrived. What were your efforts during Father Sloan's time here from 1989 to 1998?
One of the first things Father Sloan did was ask the different department heads if they had any needs. And I told him I needed a fireproof room for the archives. So we had a major building project going on for our 150th anniversary in 1997. And Father Sloan did make sure that I got the fireproof room. So here's basically what it looks like. We were able to finally create some order just by having this room. In the file cabinets, there are files about the choir, there are annual reports, there's correspondence, Sunday school records. And then if you notice on the shelf there to the right, we have the beginnings of our photograph albums of buildings and grounds. In the second picture, we can see stored in the archives room lots of boxes. Files that would take too much room in the file drawers are in those acid-free boxes. For example, our annual reports are in there, Boy Scout material from the first Boy Scout troop, anything that would take up too much room in the file drawers. We also have our big registries on the top shelf on the left, And down on the right, you'll notice some banners. Those didn't need archival protection, but if you look up on the second shelf, there's a rolled up tube and there's a banner in there that's wrapped in acid-free paper, and that's an acid-free storage case for banners. In this picture, notice the boxes on the top shelf. We put the most important things in the top file drawers and on the top shelves in case of flooding. And you want to use steel shelves that don't rust. You don't want to use wooden shelves because wood contains acid and that will deteriorate paper products.
What are other important conditions to consider?
If a church is starting out and they don't have a fireproof room, a closet would do. It's important to keep the closet locked though, and the file drawers locked, because people take a real interest in this material and they will tend to take it home and maybe never bring it back. A dehumidifier is needed to control the humidity, and metal shelving is needed that does not rust. I mentioned that earlier, and you don't want to use wooden shelving because of the acid content that would destroy paper materials.
When you said yes to Father Mill's request, did you ever dream that that yes would turn into a 33-year commitment? And what prompted you to stay with the effort all these years?
We learn from our ancestors, and they inspire us with a vision for the future. So if we have an understanding of our underlying church culture, we know what type of vision to determine for the future of the church.
Betty, you have done an amazing job of organizing and filing and preserving important documents. But if that were the end of it, that would be akin to setting up a beautiful library and then never letting anybody access the materials. So thanks to your efforts, you extended to disseminating these historical records, making them possible for others to view. So one of the first efforts of disseminating information was the book, Amazing Grace, the Sesquicentennial Remembrance, which under your leadership was written to mark the 150th anniversary of Grace Church. Please tell us what made it possible for you to organize that and move forward with that writing project.
There were two earlier publications, one that celebrated the 85th anniversary of Grace Church and the 40th anniversary of the ordination of Father Curtis. The second one was our 125th anniversary book that we saw earlier, the one that Ruth Winfield compiled. So those two publications, along with the records that were now in order in the fireproof room, enabled us to compile the big anniversary book, Amazing Grace, for the 150th anniversary, and also allowed us to compile an anniversary booklet for the 60th anniversary of our pilgrimage, which we'll be talking about later.
What did these publications reveal about the unique culture of Grace Church?
The program showed our evangelistic efforts and our humanitarian efforts. And our first example is Father Curtis, who came to Grace Church in 1911 and founded the first Boy Scout troop in Wisconsin. Here we have a picture of the first troop behind Grace Church in 1911. Now, his efforts here were to keep the boys off the street, to make them good citizens. These were his intentions for starting the Boy Scout troop. Here we have a picture of the troop in 1913. He was actually in charge of that large troop, and it wore him out. One of the parishioners came in one night after a scout meeting and found him collapsed in a chair with his head bleeding. He had just fainted after the meeting from trying to handle all these boys, which gives you some indication of how serious he was about the things he did. That particular troop led to the development of Boy Scout troop Camp Rocallayo, and it also led to the development of the first Sheboygan Boy Scout Council in Sheboygan. Another major aspect for reaching out is pilgrimages to our Walsingham Shrine. Father Curtis built the shrine in 1930, and Father Elwell started pilgrimages to it in 1951. The shrine is a replica of the Walsingham Shrine in England. We have people actually coming from England some years to the pilgrimages. So here's a picture of Father Curtis, who built the shrine, a color of the shrine with the Mary statue in the background. The shrine honors Mary. And then a window, the Mary window, made by a famous glassmaker, William Glaspie. And we'll talk more about his other windows later. This is a picture from 1961. That's Father Sweetser on the right. And the man on the left is the guardian, or was the guardian, of the Walsingham Shrine in Norfolk, England. His name was Colin Stephenson. I keep going back to our 140th anniversary for a lot of events. There were a lot of press articles at the time. We had a reporter at the Sheboygan Press who was a member of Grace Church, and he really did a good job of covering all our events. So here's an article from that pilgrimage at the time of our 140th anniversary. Music has also been a major part of our church, and it has brought in people from outside the church who sing in the choir but aren't actually church members. But it has also brought in people for musical organ concerts and other things. So we've had people have a real appreciation for music in the Episcopal Church. The music in the choir has been a draw. Father Blow started the choir in 1879. Here's a picture of that first choir in 1879. Here's a picture of Father Elwell. He further developed that music program. He really got it off the ground. He was very musical himself. He wrote music. And here's a picture of Father Elwell with the choir in 1954. Now, I said the music program brought people in. Not everybody in this picture was a member of Grace Church. In fact, they were recruited by brochures like this one, asking people if they'd like to come in and sing in the choir. Father Sweetser was a real humanitarian. He was involved in mental health in the community. Father Mills helped settle Southeast Asians after the Vietnam War. And here we have members of our congregation. All of these Southeast Asian people, these Hmong people, were baptized on one Easter Sunday. Father Schaffenberg started Love Inc. in Sheboygan. And Pat is a volunteer for that program, so I'm going to let her say a few words about Love Inc.
Love Inc., Love in the Name of Christ, opened its doors in Sheboygan County in 2015. The organization was formed when clergy in the county wanted to address the issue of people going from church to church to church, getting gas cards and food vouchers, and nothing seemed to change in their lives. So Father Schaffenberg was the organization's first board president. And as a former lawyer, he was instrumental in writing the bylaws and performing other functions that were necessary to set up a nonprofit organization.
Here's a newspaper article, a letter that he wrote to the editor, and in it he discusses the jail ministry and human trafficking. This is Father Bolson. He's the clergyman in our church right now. He's very new to the church. He came in at a difficult time during the pandemic, but we've talked about social issues here and how some clergy have addressed social issues. And what Father Bolson has done is engage the congregation in a conversation, in a dialogue about present social issues. And he tries to get us to come to an understanding of the underlying problems and the truths to be gained from discussing these issues. Pat is on the vestry, so I'm going to let her talk a little bit more about Father Bolson.
Father William Bolson came to Grace Church as rector in November of 2020, and things were shut down, so it was quite a while before we were able to meet in person and have services in person, but we did have Zoom meetings, and our services were live streamed. It was wonderful when we could, again, meet in person. Outside of his role at Grace Church as rector, Father William has received training and serves as chaplain for law enforcement in Sheboygan County, and he also serves on the board at Meade Public Library. So not only do these preserved documents give testimony to the social movements throughout the years of our history, but they also show evolution of the buildings and the expansion projects listed through the years. What can you tell us about that, Betty?
Well, we'll start with a picture of Grace Church in 1875. This is the second church building. It was actually started in 1871, but there was a fire that held up the construction, so it was completed in 1875. As the programs grew, especially the Boy Scout troop, we needed more space. So a gymnasium was added to that building in 1911. The gymnasium was used for Boy Scout troop basketball games. Father Elwell wrote musicals and staged the musicals on the stage you see in the picture for the community. There were also festivals and bazaars in there. It provided a community gathering place. And again, that has been the role of the church, to reach out to the community. By the mid-1950s, the first group of baby boomers were beginning to fill up the church, and we needed Sunday school room space. So here we have a picture of the Sunday school rooms that were built in the 1950s. Now that gym was converted, the lower level was used as a guild hall, and the upper level is where these Sunday school rooms and office space and a library were built. Music, again, continued. The choir used to sit down in front. In most Anglican churches, the choir always sat down in front. I'm thinking maybe the choir loft was moved, I can't be sure, and put in the back in the 1950s because the choir was growing and there were probably more people in the choir than could fit maybe in the pews up in front of the church. This is what the church looked like in 1990. And in 1997, at the time of our 150th anniversary project, or all that was going on for the 150th anniversary, we decided to expand again. And a big guild hall was going to be added to the east of the church. That meant the rectory next to it had to be moved east. So here we have a picture of Father Sloan at the construction site. The rectory is lifted up and it's just about to be moved to the east. And here we are with the new addition and the rectory in 1997, and it's looked like that ever since. Father Sloan was also responsible for drawing up a document, a tripartite covenant document for three churches: Grace Episcopal Church, St. Dominic's Catholic Church, and St. Peter's Lutheran Church.
So, Betty, obviously, over the decades that you have been archivist at Grace Church, a lot of things changed in terms of products and technology that were used to preserve the records. Please tell us about products and techniques, and certainly the technology that affected your efforts as archivist.
We both talked earlier about the scanning project. So that was one big way to start disseminating the knowledge again, a way to make it public. Meade Public Library got a humanities grant, and in 2017, they were going to scan and did scan historical records and pictures from throughout Sheboygan County. So Grace Church took their archives over there, and we scanned over 700 pieces of our church archival material. All of that material is posted on 3 websites: Ozaukee Sheboygan Memories, Recollection Wisconsin, and Digital Public Library of America.
What are typical research requests that you normally get?
Mostly we get genealogy requests. People want information about baptisms, weddings, burials, and marriages. And so we have all of our old registries going back several years, and I have pictures here of what the registries look like, and anybody in other churches probably has similar looking registries.
Are there inquiries about religious art and artifacts?
We do get inquiries about our artifacts and our art. We have 4 church windows that were made by William Glaspie of London, England. He was a famous glassmaker. Our first window pictured here is the Boy Scout window that commemorates the first Boy Scout troop founded at Grace Church in 1911. This is the Mary window I referred to earlier, which is in the Walsingham Chapel. So on the high altar, we also have a window of St. Augustine and St. Monica. And then above our altar, we'll get inquiries about our oldest windows. And on the altar are some of our oldest statues that were carved in Oberammergau, Germany, and we do get inquiries about those.
It's wonderful, Betty, that copies of the written documents have been made available. In addition to organizing and preserving the historical records and spearheading the written projects, you have done a great job of bringing the history out from the storage spaces into our church where we can all enjoy and learn. At just about every turn at Grace Church, we can see framed pictures, we can see art, we can see artifacts in display cabinets. And to me, having these in view is a reminder that it's a reminder of those who came before us. And it's a reminder that we are part of a continuing succession of worshipers. And I think this continuity is important. In this world where sometimes things seem kind of fragmented or disjointed, we're a part of something big. How did you go about bringing this, the art on the walls, for example?
Usually when the clergy left, a portrait was done of them, and we have displayed those portraits on the walls. They're a reminder of the programs they led us through. Of course, the whole congregation was working very hard on these programs too, but it's the clergy that we always identify with a certain time period. Here is an oil painting of Father Sweetser that was painted shortly before he left. That was permanently displayed for years above a radiator, and that's why it looks so washed out. So the lesson learned here is not to display things above radiators. This will have to be restored, this painting of Father Sweetser. We have prints, a lot of them which hung in the Sunday school rooms. This particular one was done by Tenoys Lewis, who is another well-recognized London artist. It was fading fast, so we preserved it by putting it in an archival safe frame. The glass filters out the ultraviolet light, and the matting is acid-free. So these are procedures that have to be taken to keep something of historical religious value. Oftentimes, parishioners bring in things that they think have religious significance and find a place to hang them. Here we have a picture of this is an old cleric's book page. It's been matted on acid-free paper, framed again with glass that filters out the ultraviolet light, and the descriptive card that explains what it's all about. We do put up descriptive cards so that people understand the meaning of these things. In fact, in one corridor, we have a historic display of our most historical moments, and each picture has a descriptive card explaining why that's so important. Father Osborne took a real interest in our textiles. Now, textiles as they age get very fragile, and about the only thing, if they aren't preserved somehow, would be to throw them out, and there's just too much artwork in them. So when he was here, a lot of the textile items I'm going to show you now were encouraged by Father Osborne. So we have an altar frontal here. This is St. Joseph's banner. It is the banner for St. Joseph's Acolyte Guild. Here we have a Hmong embroidery piece. This is a one-of-a-kind piece because it pictures models of Grace Church. So if this particular piece would ever leave the church, it should be put in a museum. We also have other embroidery pieces of their life in Southeast Asia. Here we have framed some old vestments. And here is a newer banner from our 140th anniversary. And this is the banner I referred to earlier when I showed a picture of the archives room. It's rolled up in acid-free paper and stored in an acid-free preservation tube. We also have artifacts in the archives room. We have a pair of these light fixtures. They hung on either side of the altar. They've been painted and restored, and eventually they're going to hang in our back hall. So we do reuse things.
How did you utilize the display cases?
We have one display case of rotating displays, so we think of a historical theme that maybe ties into a season of the church. And then we have one permanent case, or display case, where we keep a permanent display of Christmas figurines. They are there permanently because our church was chartered in Advent on December 6th, 1847.
Moving on to another topic, Betty, please tell us about landmarking our church and rectory and this chapel from where we are recording. Landmarking is an important part of conserving our buildings. Why were the buildings landmarked?
Here's a picture of our second church building again, the one that was started in 1871. And as you can see, it has a distinctive Gothic style. And then the clergy that were affiliated with that church, especially our significant programs, the Boy Scout troop, the founding of the first Boy Scout troop, the pilgrimages, and the resettling of the Southeast Asians, those activities happened in that church. The clergy were in that church, so it's its distinctive Gothic style, and then the programs that took place in the church. Now, the rectory has also been landmarked because the clergy who headed up all those programs lived there. It's also one of the oldest houses in the city. It was built in 1853, and it's actually been moved twice. It was moved from across the street originally, and then it's been moved to the east now ever since 1997.
And who landmarked the buildings?
A local landmarks organization and the Wisconsin State Historical Society.
What changes can and cannot be made to the buildings?
The exteriors can't be changed, but the interiors can be modified. In fact, we had new air conditioning put in Grace Church, and the vents are visible, but we painted them to match the walls.
So why were the buildings allowed to be landmarked even though there have been modifications?
The architectural style hasn't changed that much, as you can see in the picture that I have up right now. It still portrays a feelings of times past, especially when you look at the west side of the church, the style of the rectory. If you've ever seen a building that's completely eclectic, that hasn't happened here. And it's all the history in the church is playing a big part, all of the events we talked about.
Explain how Grace Church became part of Sheboygan's first historic district.
In 2009, the Sheboygan Planning and Development Commission contacted Father Perry about creating a historic district in the square block where 4 churches are located. The churches have been there a very long time. So here we have an early picture of Grace Church in St. Mark's behind it. This has to be about 1912 because St. Mark's was built in 1912. So St. Mark's is in the historic district. Here's a picture before 1905. That's Grace Church and St. Luke's Methodist Church across the street. And then we have a picture again after 1905 or about 1905 of Grace Church and St. Luke's Methodist Church. We don't have an early picture of Hope Reformed Church, which is just east of Grace Church. So that's why that's not in the picture. The city placed 2 historic district signs on our corner. So they're right out in front of the church, and I have those pictured here. And notice in the second sign, it says Grace Episcopal Church, 1871. That's because that's when construction was started on the second building, which is standing there now. So that's why the date is not 1875 there.
What does Sheboygan's Historic Preservation Ordinance specify?
It provides guidelines and designs for any changes that are going to take place. Because the architecture is so symbolic. For example, a steeple marks the church's presence in a community. The artistic glass windows, if they aren't just a plain glass or colored glass, draw people into the church. You have to go into the church in order to see the windows. And also the bell towers, when the bells are ringing, it brings the whole community in sync. So by destroying the original character, you're just wiping out history. So that's the reason for the guidelines and the design suggestions.
So what are some challenges you encountered along the way?
Well, I'm coming back to the archives room. I have a picture here. As you can see, it's cramped and packed. So we need money for a state-of-the-art archives room. Even though those materials are accessible online, they still have to be handled occasionally. And they're not easy to retrieve. So that's one of the major challenges.
What about disappointments?
My biggest disappointments are the things that have been given away, I think because people didn't understand the symbolism in them. In the first picture on the left, down in front, there's a picture of a cast iron lectern in the shape of an eagle. In the next picture, you see a better shot of its wings. The symbolism in the eagle lecterns in the Anglican Church, a Bible rests on the lectern, and the spreading of the eagle's wings symbolizes the spreading of the Word of God. So I think somebody didn't understand the symbolism, and that particular lectern was replaced with a plain wooden lectern. Another disappointment, I think, because somebody didn't understand the symbolism, is the crystal chandelier in the Walsingham Shrine pictured here. Crystal represents clarity, something unblemished, something clear, in this case pertaining to Mary. That chandelier was very difficult to clean, and I think that's why somebody just put in an easier chandelier, but it is a disappointment, knowing the history of it and what it meant and the fact that it's gone.
Can this practice be changed?
The vestry should draw up a policy about how items will be dispersed, and that very topic was talked about right before Father Schaffenberg left and the pandemic started, so that would be a topic for the vestry, Pat.
What highlights and satisfaction have you experienced over the 33 years?
In the picture here, you'll notice we have our original Bedford stone font. That's from the first church that was built in 1847. Also, I have a picture of our original Stations of the Cross. They were also done by the famous English artist T. Noyes Lewis. They're from the arts and crafts period, 1910 to 1920. They hung in the church. They were replaced with new plaques. And at that time, some of the parishioners took these watercolors home. Eventually, they came back. So we fixed the frames and we put archival glass in there, and they're again displayed in our narthex. There's a lot of history in personal items, so we like keeping those in our collection. So here we have a picture of an autograph book that belonged to Father Curtis. Somebody bought it at an estate sale. They Googled the church and they found out that it belonged to us and they brought it in. We've also had that happen with items from across the country. Father Blow must have sent somebody out east the earliest picture of the second structure, and that picture just came back to us a couple years ago. So somebody mailed it out there. But anyhow, it's very rewarding when things come back or things have been kept. The last item I have as a very rewarding experience was the compilation of that Amazing Grace, our major history book, for the 150th anniversary in 1997.
Have there been church governance changes regarding the archives?
The diocese told the diocesan churches to put a bylaw in with their constitution stating that an archivist should be appointed. And that procedure has been implemented at Grace Church. There is a bylaw added regarding archivists.
Please tell us how you have helped churches within the Episcopal Diocese regarding their archival efforts.
I'm a former member of a diocesan archives committee, and in that role, I did consult with other churches in the diocese about their archives. And I also submitted an article, a historical article about Grace Church to the diocese for an upcoming diocesan history book. I also consulted with St. Thomas Catholic Church in Newton. That was 4 churches came together to create that Catholic Church: St. Isidore, St. Joseph, St. Casimir, and St. Wendell. When they combined into one church, they wanted to do a thorough history, and so I helped them, gave them advice on the history book and on their archives.
Betty, what was your advice to the archivist who replaced you?
Polly Schmeiser replaced me. She's the archivist now. We brainstormed the 175th anniversary with Father Schaffenberg and ideas for it. We discussed an upcoming history book, a column in the Angelus, a possible historic preservation committee who would keep an eye on things so they don't leave the church, and the feasibility of a state-of-the-art archives room. And that archives room, Polly actually initiated, because when I recruited her, I didn't even get to that point yet, but she brought it up.
Betty, what is your recommendation, your charge to churches and other organizations and individuals as they move forward to protect their documents and objects? For example, how do you recommend that they deal with personal confidential information?
There will be material probably in the minutes of the governing body, like the vestry in the Episcopal Church, that's historically significant but has a negative connotation. It has to be kept, that information, because it's historically significant, but it isn't a file that you want to hand over to somebody where it will be made, public and cause gossip and everything else.
Do you keep personal papers and items?
We do keep personal papers, especially, and items if they relate to the history of the church. That matter has been brought up with regard to the Boy Scout materials and personal things regarding the Boy Scout troop that belonged to Father Curtis. Some people think the material should be in a historical society or museum, but we keep it at Grace Church because the Scout troop, being the first troop in Wisconsin, and all the history of how it evolved in Sheboygan County is so tied to the church. So we keep Father Curtis's personal items, but that's a decision that has to be made case by case by case.
Do you discard anything?
Not if it's historically significant, no.
And what about duplicates?
We keep quality duplicates. The very ragged ones we throw out. And if something can still be used, but it's not quality, we keep it for researchers so that they can have a hands-on experience.
Do you give materials to other historical organizations to preserve?
We don't do that because we're afraid then that the people in the church will get accustomed to somebody else taking care of their history and will not tend to do it themselves.
Should anything be put in the archives room? Anything historical?
Yes, and the important thing for any church to do is find the most reliable spot they have, be it a closet, or if they're fortunate enough to have a fireproof room, like I'm again picturing in my last picture of the archives here.
Were there any funny or interesting stories or experiences in your 33 years?
One time I entered the archives room and was surprised to see an urn of ashes standing on one of the file cabinets. A memorial service was being scheduled. That's why the ashes were there. And I was surprised and shocked, but I thought it was a good spot.
Betty, it's hard to find the adequate words to express thanks and admiration for all you've done. You've done an amazing job of preserving and making available the treasure trove, as we mentioned earlier, of materials that we have at Grace Church. Thanks for the 33 years of so generously giving of your time and talent. We have this record available of our 175-year-old story. And understanding that story, understanding our past, helps us lean into the future that God intends for us at Grace Church and beyond our doors. Thank you, Betty.
Well, thank you, Pat. And I'd just like to close by saying that Father Curtis and all of the archivists who followed him, I think would be pleased to know that the archives are in the state they are right now. And I'm, of course, hoping for the same in the future. And I just want to comment again on what you said at the beginning of the presentation, that this presentation was intended to be a tutorial for the archivists at Grace Church and other churches. But if anybody's interested in a comprehensive history of Grace Episcopal Church, they can go to the 3 websites that we posted earlier. Otherwise, most of the local libraries have our publications like Amazing Grace and the 60th anniversary of the pilgrimage. So there are other places to go for a comprehensive history of Grace Church.